Hi, my name is Daniel, and this is Natural Disasters. 1 hour ago, a 4-kilometer section of Sicily's southwestern coastline collapsed into the Mediterranean Sea, taking buildings, roads, and centuries of history with it. But here is what nobody is saying out loud yet. This is not a surprise, this is not a freak accident, and this is absolutely not the last time it is going to happen. Because the data shows this exact cliff has been collapsing on a 30-year cycle since before most of us were born. And right now, scientists are staring at satellite readings that suggest the next collapse already beginning. The event, March 12, 2026. The first emergency call reaches the Agrigento Provincial Command at 6:43. A fisherman named Giuseppe Ferraro, launching his boat from the harbor below the Real Monte cliffs, watches the white face of the headland simply fold. Not crumble, not erode. Fold, like something beneath it withdrew all at once. The sound he describes to responders is not a crash. It is a silence that precedes the crash. Then, the ocean swallows everything. By 7:15, a second section gives way, 1.2 kilometers north of the first failure point. Italian Coast Guard helicopter Romeo Sierra 4 confirms what ground units cannot yet reach. A 4-kilometer section of cliff face, rising up to 90 meters above sea level in places, has detached from the Sicilian coastline and collapsed into the sea. The debris field extends 300 meters offshore. The famous Scala dei Turchi, the white marl staircase formation that has appeared on 10 million postcards and drawn visitors from 40 countries, is partially gone. By 8:30, Real Monte's coastal road is closed in both directions. Emergency services from Agrigento, Porto Empedocle, and Siculiana converge on a town of 4,000 people who are being told to move inland immediately. 300 residents in the cliff-adjacent district of Marina di Real Monte receive mandatory evacuation orders. 14 buildings in the collapse zone show active structural failure. 2 of them are already leaning toward the sea at angles that make engineers physically uncomfortable to look at. The numbers are staggering, and they are still climbing. The town, Real Monte, and the White Cliffs. Most people outside of Sicily have never heard of Real Monte. I actually want to change that today, because I spent 3 weeks researching this story, and what I found completely reframed how I understood Mediterranean coastal geology. And honestly, how I understood what it means to build a life on ground that is secretly dissolving beneath you. Real Monte sits on Sicily's southwestern coast, roughly 30 kilometers west of Agrigento, in a province that has been inhabited continuously for 3,000 years. The cliffs here are not made of granite or basalt. They are made of white marl, a soft, porous mixture of clay and calcium carbonate that was deposited in shallow Miocene seas 5 to 7 million years ago. Over millennia, wind and water sculpted these formations into something genuinely extraordinary. Layered terraces of brilliant white rock descend to turquoise water, natural staircases carved by erosion that look designed by an architect rather than built by time. The town built its entire identity around those cliffs. The fishing community, the summer tourism, the restaurants lining the promenade, the families who have lived in the same cliffside houses for 5 generations. Real Monte is not a wealthy resort. It is a working coastal town that found itself sitting on top of one of the most visually spectacular geological formations in the entire Mediterranean, and one of the most structurally fragile. The 30-year cycle. Here is where the story gets extraordinary, and I will be honest, this is the part where I get genuinely angry, because the data on this was sitting in Italian Geological Survey archives for decades, and almost nobody acted on it. In 1966, a significant section of the Real Monte cliffs collapsed into the sea. Local records describe the event as sudden, unexpected, and catastrophic for the fishing community below. Homes were evacuated. A section of coastal road was destroyed. The Italian press covered it briefly, then moved on. 30 years later, in 1996, it happened again. This time, a different section of the same cliff system failed. Again, buildings evacuated. Again, road infrastructure destroyed. Again, covered briefly, then forgotten. A geological survey commissioned by the Agrigento provincial government in 1998 documented the pattern in language that was remarkably calm for a report describing a repeating catastrophe. The surveyors noted cyclical failure events consistent with progressive subsurface clay destabilization and recommended enhanced monitoring of at-risk zones. The monitoring stations were installed. The data was collected. And today, 30 years later, almost to the month, the cliff collapsed again. Most people gloss over this part, but I think it is secretly the whole point of everything. The 30-year cycle was documented. It was known. The communities living below these cliffs were never meaningfully relocated. The infrastructure was never permanently hardened. And so, this morning, at 6:43, Giuseppe Ferraro watched what every geological model said was coming, and arrived anyway. The geology. What is eating Sicily from below? To understand why this keeps happening, you need to understand what white marl actually is at the molecular level. And I promise this is more terrifying than it sounds. Dr. Francesca Lombardi, lead coastal geologist at the University of Palermo, has been studying the Real Monte Formation for 11 years. Her research describes a failure mechanism that is slow, invisible, and essentially irreversible once it reaches a critical threshold. The marl layers are interbedded with softer clay horizons that act as natural slip plains. When Mediterranean saltwater infiltrates the cliff base through tidal action and storm surge, it does not simply erode the surface. It chemically dissolves the clay minerals in those internal horizons, reducing friction between structural layers that have been locked together for millions of years. The process takes decades. During that time, the cliff face shows nothing alarming. No visible cracking. No surface movement that the average resident would notice. The dissolution is entirely internal. The cliff looks exactly as solid as it always did right up until the moment it is not. Satellite interferometry data from the European Space Agency reveals what the human eye cannot. In the 18 months before this morning's collapse, the cliff top above the failure zone was subsiding at a rate of 4.3 millimeters per month. That reading had been accelerating since last September. Geologists at the INGV, Italy's National Institute of Geophysics and Volcanology, flagged the trend in a December report. The flag generated a recommendation for increased monitoring, not evacuation, monitoring. Meanwhile, sea surface temperatures in the Strait of Sicily have averaged 1.8 degrees Celsius above the 20th century baseline for the past 3 consecutive years. Warmer water means accelerated chemical dissolution of carbonate rock. It means more energetic wave action out of the cliff base. It means the internal clock of the 30-year cycle is not remaining constant. It is compressing. The gap between collapses may no longer be 30 years. The next failure event could arrive in 20 or 10 or less. The human cost. Behind every geological statistic this morning stands a person who had no warning. Carmela Russo is 73 years old. She was born in the same house where she woke up this morning to the sound of her walls cracking. Not the dramatic, cinematic cracking you imagine when you picture a disaster. A quiet, intimate sound. Like the house itself was exhaling something it had been holding in for 30 years. Her family has lived on Via Marina for 4 generations. Her grandfather built the original structure with his own hands in 1921. Her mother raised 6 children inside those walls. Carmela raised 3 more. The evacuation officer who knocked on her door at 7:45 did not find her panicking. He found her sitting at her kitchen table with a cup of coffee, watching the ceramic tiles on her floor separate along a line running from the window toward the interior wall. Slow, deliberate, like the ground beneath her was making a decision it had already made up its mind about. She tells him she has seen cracks before, after the 1996 event. The government came then too. Inspectors with clipboards, engineers with reassuring explanations. Repair crews who filled the gaps and told everyone the problem was solved. She believed them. She stayed. She watched her children grow up in that house and told herself the ground was solid. She packs one bag, medications. Her husband's photograph. The documents she keeps in the metal box on the top shelf of the wardrobe. She does not look back when they walk her to the bus. I think about that detail more than almost anything else in this story. She does not look back. After 73 years and 4 generations and everything those walls contained, she just walks forward. There is something devastating about that kind of composure. 2 streets away, the Ferrara brothers are having a very different kind of morning. Marco and Luca have run their dive shop on the Real Monte waterfront since 1982. 44 years of business, built around those exact cliffs, are now sitting on the ocean floor. Their entire inventory is inside the evacuation zone. Their boat is moored at a dock that engineers have flagged as structurally compromised. Their equipment, their bookings, their livelihood, all of it is behind a police barrier they are not permitted to cross. And when Marco finally gets through to his insurance provider at 11 in the morning, he is told what thousands of coastal business owners discover only after the disaster arrives. His policy contains a ground movement exclusion clause buried in the fine print that his broker never once mentioned when he signed it. By noon, 340 residents are displaced. 8 businesses are shuttered with no reopening timeline. Emergency shelters in Agrigento fill with people who arrived carrying almost nothing and cannot be told when or whether they are going home. The children in those shelters keep asking the same question: when can we go back? Nobody has an answer. That silence is its own kind of collapse. The bigger picture: Mediterranean coastal collapse. I personally think this is the most underrated part of the story, and it is the part that should be making international headlines, but is not. The geological formation that failed this morning does not stop at Real Monte. The same Miocene marl and clay sequence runs continuously along approximately 900 kilometers of Sicilian and southern Italian coastline. The same interbedded slip plains, the same chemical vulnerability to saltwater infiltration, the same subsurface dissolution mechanism that nobody can see until the moment the cliff face decides to leave. Geological surveys conducted between 2018 and 2023 identified 22 high-priority cliff sections along this corridor, showing subsidence signatures consistent with internal layer failure. Of those 22 sections, 14 have active communities built on or below the cliff edge. Combined population in the identified high-risk zones exceeds 60,000 people. The coastline between Agrigento and Marsala shows the highest density of at-risk formations. The area around Selinunte contains some of the most archaeologically significant ruins in the entire Mediterranean, sitting on cliff geology that is actively destabilizing. Structures that survived Carthaginian invasion, Roman conquest, Arab occupation, and 2,000 years of Mediterranean weather are now facing an adversary they were never designed to resist: a warming sea that is quietly eating the ground beneath them. Researchers at the University of Catania have begun mapping what they call a regional failure corridor. The preliminary data suggests that the same warming-driven acceleration observed at Real Monte is occurring simultaneously across multiple sections of this corridor. The collapses are not just repeating, they are synchronizing. Government response and economic fallout. The Italian government response this morning was swift by the standards of bureaucratic emergency management. Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni convened an emergency cabinet session at 9 a.m. and signed a declaration activating national disaster protocols for Agrigento province by 10:30. The Italian Civil Protection Department deployed 300 personnel to the Real Monte area within 4 hours of the initial collapse. The European Union Solidarity Fund application was submitted by early afternoon. European Union disaster mechanism rules require a damage assessment before funds can be released. Preliminary estimates place structural and infrastructure losses in the Real Monte coastal zone at €340 million. The assessment process takes a minimum of 8 weeks. The families in those Agrigento shelters will wait longer than that. Tourism collapse is immediate and total. The Scala dei Turchi formation drew approximately 400,000 visitors annually, generating €180 million in direct and indirect economic activity across the province. That number does not go to zero gradually, it goes to zero today. Hotel cancellations across the Agrigento coast will reach into summer bookings before the week is over. Travel advisories issued by Germany, France, and the United Kingdom warn citizens against non-essential travel to the affected zone. The economic damage to communities that were already among the poorest in southern Italy arrives on top of everything else. What comes next? The monitoring data coming out of the Real Monte area tonight does not suggest this morning's collapse has stabilized the system. It suggests the opposite. ENGV seismometers positioned along the cliff edge are detecting continuous microfracturing in the sections immediately adjacent to the collapsed zone. This is the acoustic signature of progressive rock separation. The cliff is not finished. The same internal dissolution process that produced this morning's event has been active across a much wider area for years, and the removal of the failed section has altered the stress distribution in the remaining cliff face. Engineers describe this effect as unloading. When a large mass of material suddenly disappears, the material around it experiences a rapid shift in the forces that were keeping it compressed and stable. Those adjacent sections, already chemically weakened, now face a new stress environment they were not in equilibrium with. The probability of secondary failure events in the next 72 hours is not low. The 30-year cycle is the framework scientists have used to understand Real Monte. But a cycle is only a cycle if the underlying conditions remain constant. The Mediterranean is not constant anymore. Sea surface temperatures are rising. Storm intensity is increasing. The chemical dissolution rate is accelerating with every degree of warming. The clock that previously ticked every 30 years is not ticking at the same speed today that it was in 1966. Dr. Lombardi, speaking to Italian state television from Palermo tonight, used language that emergency planners found difficult to hear. She said we should stop thinking about the next collapse and start thinking about the next several collapses because the geological evidence suggests we are entering a period of accelerated and sequential failure along this entire coastline. The question is not whether additional sections will fall. The question is which communities are standing below them when they do. 3.5 million people live within 20 kilometers of at-risk marl cliff formations along Sicily's and southern Italy's coastline. The evacuation plans that exist were written for individual events at individual locations. They were not written for a regional failure corridor that activates simultaneously across dozens of sites. Tonight, the white cliffs of Real Monte that are still standing glow faintly in the moonlight above a debris field that stretches 300 meters into the sea. They look exactly as solid as they always did. That is precisely the problem. The cliff that is still standing does not look any different from the cliff that fell this morning. Same color, same face, same appearance of permanence that has reassured residents and tourists and city planners for generations. The dissolution is internal. The slip planes are loaded. The salt water is still working. The cycle is not over. It is not ending. If anything, it is just getting started. And the Mediterranean coast that existed throughout the 20th century may be fundamentally different by the time the 21st century is done with it. The ground beneath Sicily is speaking. The question is whether anyone in a position to act is finally ready to listen.